COVID-19 is enabling politicians to turn freedom from an individual right into a conditional bureaucratic dispensation. Defining down freedom was exemplified by the G7 summit that became a ludicrous and hypocritical lockdowners' victory lap. The G7 leaders, meeting in Cornwall, issued a communiqué pledging to protect individuals from forced labor and to ensure that global supply chains are free from the use of forced labor. But the political bosses had no concern about forced non-labor, their own decrees that destroyed tens of millions of jobs. That was no problem because, as the G7 leaders boasted, we have provided unprecedented support to citizens and businesses, totaling over $12 trillion, including fiscal support and liquidity measures. But handouts are no substitute for freedom and self-reliance. Government aid is always only one decree away from mandating terms of submission. The G7 summiteers proclaimed a boatload of environmental goals. Will future stimulus payments be restricted to people who reduce their carbon footprint or abandon their non-electric vehicles? The Biden administration was thrilled that G7 summiteers adapted its slogan, Build Back Better, in the communiqué. That slogan will entitle politicians to snare more revenue and power to repair the damage from the shutdowns they inflicted. Biden-style rebuilding presumes that any government spending confers vast benefits, at least on politicians. Biden's colleagues also seconded his call for placing at least 30% of all land and water under government restrictions in the name of conservation. G7 leaders enjoyed parties and plenty of backslapping, privileges denied to nearby British citizens whose lives continue semi-paralyzed by pervasive government restrictions. Brits were told that their lockdown misery would end on June 21st, which became known as Freedom Day. But British politicians have invoked the fear of new variants to justify extending the lockdown at least another month and possibly far longer. Prime Minister Boris Johnson declared on Monday, "Now is the time to ease off the accelerator," regardless of how many individual rights become roadkill. Spiked editor Brendan O'Neill declared that this further suspension of liberty is only possible in a society that has thoroughly devalued freedom, and derided the creeping embrace of the lockdown lifestyle among significant sections of the smart set. In the US, President Joe Biden designated the 4th of July as Americans' shrink-wrapped Freedom Day. On March 11th, Biden declared that if people obey government decrees, there's a good chance you, your families and friends will be permitted to get together in your backyard or in your neighborhood and have a cookout or a barbecue and celebrate Independence Day. To celebrate our independence from this virus on July 4th with family and friends in small groups, we all need to mask up until everyone has a chance to get their shot. Biden converted the 4th of July into a benchmark of submission to presidential decrees. On May 4th, Biden announced that he wanted 70% of American adults to have at least one COVID vaccine by July 4th. On June 2nd, Biden declared that people should exercise your freedom to get vaccinated so Americans can enjoy a summer of freedom. Freedom to get politically mandated injections was not one of the clauses included in the Bill of Rights.
But a context with autocratic governments around the world, as whether or not democracies can compete with them in the rapidly changing 21st century. And I think how we act and whether we pull together as democracies is going to determine whether our grandkids look back 15 years from now and say, did they step up?
Regardless of the Biden administration's alarmism, most states have already lifted lockdown orders. Biden's attempted expropriation of Independence Day had no impact on his honeymoon with the media. When the Pulitzer Prizes were bestowed last Friday, No awards were given for exposing the frauds and follies of repressive COVID-19 policies that ravaged prosperity and freedom. Instead, the Pulitzer for Public Service was awarded to a New York Times team that included Donald McNeil. As Jeffrey Tucker reported, early during the pandemic, McNeil fanned fear with a bizarre article headlined, "To take on the coronavirus, go medieval on it." He urged American policymakers to rely on tactics from the era of the Black Death. Pen terrified citizens up inside their poisoned cities. Harsh measures horrify civil libertarians, but they often save lives, especially when they are imposed in the early days. McNeil turbocharged his alarmism by overestimating the likely death toll by over 20-fold. Ironically, at a time when the American media has become far more critical of police power, pundits have consecrated bureaucratic power. In the COVID era, destroying freedom is a negligible loss, akin to a government agency misplacing a few hundred filing cabinets. But the scant controversy over lockdowns is a sign that many media outlets are happy to see liberty inverted into unquestioning obedience to any command issued by any government official.
I'm sitting with the Canadian flag.
Yes, we reverse it to be friendly. It's a way of connecting people.
Politicians could decimate freedom because their COVID-19 decrees almost instantly became haloed with the aura of science, regardless of how often the official guidance changed. Since Biden became president, COVID vaccines have also become sacrosanct, and casting any doubts on their safety or efficacy is portrayed as proof of idiocy or villainy. Politicians and their media allies now talk as if the only reliable gauge of health and safety is the percentage of Americans who have been injected, ignoring the natural immunity that the 115 million people who had COVID infections enjoy. The result is a long series of socialist-style victory proclamations, substituting the number of arms injected for bogus statistics on the wheat harvest from collective farms. And anyone who refuses to be vaccinated is the new kulak, reviled and portrayed as a dire threat to the survival of everything decent. It would not be surprising if politicians limited future COVID handouts to individuals who could prove they were vaccinated. Many Americans presume that the political travails of COVID are mostly in the rearview mirror. The small print of the G7 communiqué is hell on such optimism.
To truly beat COVID-19 anywhere, we have to beat it everywhere. That's something we've understood right from the start of this pandemic.
And as long as the pandemic is out of control, rulers must remain unleashed. If anyone has the virus, then no one is free. Or at least no one should be permitted to be free. The prerogatives and precedents that multiply during the COVID pandemic are waiting to be exploited for the next viral outbreak, or maybe simply to make some really dramatic gestures on climate change. The G7 communiqué endlessly promised transparency, but only fools should expect official candor during pandemics or other politically proclaimed emergencies. British scientists who shaped government COVID policies recently admitted using unethical and dystopian fear-mongering to terrorize people into submission. One scientist declared that using fear smacks of totalitarianism, and another scientist admitted being stunned by the weaponization of behavioral psychology to enforce compliance with COVID dictates. American politicians and government agencies relied on many of the same fear tactics in this country. Docile media helped sway people to view other Americans' freedoms as the deadliest threat to their own health. Instead, the biggest danger citizens faced was that their rulers would not have sufficient power to force everyone else to stop working, stop worshiping, stay inside, and get injected. No-fault Czars are no substitute for individual liberty. Politicians vindicated lockdowns by claiming that all the sacrifices are justified if they save just one life. But what about just one freedom? Especially freedoms previously enjoyed by hundreds of millions of people.
The global health emergency has shown us what a truly borderless crisis looks like. And of course, we did not fully see COVID coming, yet climate change and biodiversity loss represent a borderless crisis, the solutions to which have been argued about and postponed for far too long. The fight against this terrible pandemic provides, if ever one was needed, a crystal clear example of the scale and sheer speed at which the global community can tackle crises when we combine political will with business ingenuity and public mobilization. Ladies and gentlemen, we are doing it for the pandemic. So, if you don't mind me saying so, we must also do it for the planet. Because to build back better, we need above all a truly effective partnership between government and business in order to mobilize finance and innovation and to deliver a just transition for developed and developing economies alike. Only through this sort of government and business coalition can we once again literally put the wind in our sails and win the battle against climate change. And the window of opportunity to tackle it is closing extremely fast.
Instead of build back better, further empowering reckless rulers, we need to build back freer.
How's that?
I was supposed to be looking as if you're enjoying it.
Yes, definitely. We have been enjoying ourselves in spite of appearances. The guy can look at is